takes place about whether economists and human rights can find common language, common ways of thinking, and so on. And by ensuring that somebody of the quality of Rajiv Malhotra entered the Secretariat of the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, we have, thanks to his work, and because he's too modest to talk about it, I will talk about it now, we have an outstanding contribution from the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights to indicators, following the indicators and the methodology for indicators that are used by traditional economists, by your organization. And I think we owe it kind of directly to you, but indirectly to Arjun, that this enormous bridge was built. And I think Siobhan McNenary is making that bridge in the World Bank as a human rights lawyer working in the vice presidency, for the legal vice presidency of the World Bank. There are these people who are, here we have a human rights person transplanted to the World Bank, a finance and economic analysis person transplanted to human rights. Those are the bridges that have made a big difference, and Arjun's behind them. I don't know, you can disagree with me.
No, I would have started off my intervention by saying just precisely that. I think I owe a great deal to Dr. Sengupta. He introduced me to the domain of human rights, and he was a mentor in that sense. So a lot of my own research agenda over the last 20 years, as long as I've known Steve, at least part of it has been influenced by him. So he had this capacity of, bringing in people to inform a particular discourse, which was oblivious of several things that were happening outside as well. So his contributions, I would say, would be right up there. And at a personal level, for me, I think I owe him a great debt intellectually, and as a colleague. I work with him here in India in the policy making domain as well. So I'm really happy, and I endorse what you said in terms of maybe among the top 10 people. I wouldn't know sufficiently about many others who would have contributed to the UN and the building up of the UN over the last 8 decades, but he would certainly be one of those names in that list.
Thank you. And I thank you for that. To be that, I hear that confirmation, and anyone else that contribute to that part of it. But I can also say, in light of what I heard also from Steve Marks this morning, that he was a top 3 for everybody that knew him. He was a great mentor too. And there are so many examples, even in this very place that we're sitting. The other thing I was going to say is to try to bring some perspective of my own relationship to the UN. So I can actually say that 50 years ago was the first time I went into the UN. I had a colleague, later to be colleague, who was at the permanent mission in the UN, of Iceland to the UN, and he invited me to come over to, I was in college in the US then, to the UN. And I can still remember what I thought when I came in. You've seen the building, you've seen maybe the hall, but I was invited into the so-called Delegates Lounge, which is the sanctum, well, at least one of the main places where actually things happened. And I still remember being in awe at that time. And I can tell you, I went back now after maybe a 3-year absence to a meeting in April, and I went into that same room and I felt the same awe. Now that's 50 years. But when it came to look for graduate school, I had very good advice from one of my professors. He asked me, because I had to choose between 3 U.S. colleges, U.S. law schools. And he said, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to work at the UN. He said, well, you go to Columbia. Because and you don't have to take a shuttle, from Cambridge or other places that I was considering going to. And sure enough, when it came to interview, I get on the 144 bus, Columbia's in the west side of Manhattan, and I'm in the UN in 20 minutes. And so when I was interviewed for jobs, that's what happened. And so over the course of that period since then, I'd like to say that I've been involved in all 3 kinds of types of activities. If we take the analogy with domestic constitutional structure. So I was in the Secretariat for the first 4 years of my professional life, right out of law school. And I was passed from that to be my representative of my country in two UN meetings, attended many meetings of the UN, various conferences, but also the General Assembly. Represented Iceland in the 6th committee, the so-called Leave Committee. And then I was honored to become a judge in a very, well, people, if you look at that court, it looks like a UN court. It's not strictly speaking, but the Law of the Sea Tribunal. So all three, you might say, parts of the governmental structure. And in between, I've been honored to serve on the International Law Commission, which is the law-making or law-making body of the UN, out of the General Assembly, which makes proposals to the General Assembly for its work. And then, in fact, a consultant to the Human Rights Council as well. So I've had a great variety of experiences with the UN. Now, people ask me, and I think I already introduced by saying that the feeling I have for that UN. I am not cynical about the UN, not cynical at all. No matter what you hear from various people speaking about its shortcomings, it is still, the hope for mankind, and that's how I want to start off our discussion this afternoon.
I'm afraid, Steve, nobody said it, or maybe you said it and I didn't hear it.
Steve,
Today is UN Day. You didn't say that, right? We're talking about this. We're spontaneously talking about the United Nations, and I see that the Secretary General has highlighted his speech today for United Nations Day. Never give up.
Oh.
So there we are. There's our theme. There's our theme. But today is UN Day, 24th of October. So I thought, since that wasn't explicitly stated, we really should state.
yes, thank you.
Never give up.
That's a very. We should have had that speech.
We have a video. We could actually play the Secretary.
Let's plan that after the day. Yeah, let's have his annual statement. And I'm tempted to tell a story about when you told me that you would be in San Francisco. In fact, one of our colleagues here was in San Francisco when the UN was established. He was only a child, but actually a baby. But I actually know many people who were there this day in 1945, and I have to. I was going to say this in summary, but I cannot. I use the occasion now. I thought my life's work was in the international field of the law of the sea. You might say 80% of my professional life, including that first job that I had at the UN. And many people participating in the negotiations, of my students in the course know, thought of, this is the 1970s, late 70s, where the UN was not in a good place. We had the Cold War dividing any preventing any possibilities of actions in the war and peace elements I mentioned to you. And many of the people participating in that saw the law of the sea as a way to revive the spirit of the Charter, the San Francisco spirit. And they worked in that way and were successful. And I have to add the other subject that I am involved with, the International Criminal Court, was an extension of that. And the final point that I discussed with somebody just recently, who had been like me in both of these endeavors, and he said, why can we not do that in the fields that are of contemporary concern, including climate change? And the answer to that question is also at least never give up. Anyway, we'll find it later.
Bart will show at a break, we'll show the video of Never Give Up. I want to acknowledge another staff person of the United Nations system here, Vikram, around this table, who will be speaking on the next panel, so we'll do the introductions then. But several of us have carried that blue laissez-passer around the world, and different. I spent 12 years in the UN system, so it is sentimental, and since we're being sentimental about it, I guess you were referring to somebody who happened to be there at the act of creation, and there's something that you may not be aware of. Are we going to take too much time into the panelists?
No, fine. Manoj is not with us. So
okay, so
using his time.
I was also brought up, I was born in San Francisco with the UN Charter, and brought up across the Golden Gate Bridge in a place called Marin County. And one of the places that makes Marin County world famous is a national park called Muir Woods. Has anybody been to Muir Woods?
Yes.
You've been there. Nobody else? No? You haven't been to Muir Woods? Anyway, in the central part of the walkway through these great sequoia trees, which is a magnificent natural setting, there's a place, and I'm apologizing in advance if I get emotional, where there's a simple display case with some pictures in it. And it shows something that I'd completely forgotten. When President Roosevelt died, the World Conference on World Organization was meeting in San Francisco, drafting the UN Charter. And the President of the General Assembly at that time made the courageous decision to honor President Roosevelt by moving the whole General Assembly of the United Nations to this most inspiring spot located right in the middle of the sequoias in Muir Woods. And there's a picture of him standing there. And as you look up at these trees that are 3,000–4,000 years old, it's one of the most beautiful spots in the world, one of the most inspiring places in the world. The intention was to give them the last inspiration to see the job through. Never give up. That's the theme of UN Day today. And never give up. That was the theme of the visit to Muir Woods. We went back to San Francisco and finished the job. Now we're trying to, of course, continue with the theme never give up, with the purposes of the United Nations still being valid, but the means and methods of carrying it forward running into serious difficulties. And that's going to be part of the discussion of this panel. So excuse me, but you invited it.
No.
You got it.
Thank you. I'm very grateful. And please, I encourage, when we have come to the conclusion of this, or even in between, others to join in this discussion, because let's have a real discussion, which will be headed off by our panelists. Dr. Manoj Sinha is unable to attend, so we have now four, as I said before, people with various different disciplines. And I would ask you, please, Jabir, to begin.
These are a bunch of scattered thoughts that I have on the issue. They are not well formed. I am not a practitioner of rights in any way or involved in that way, but have been thinking about human rights quite a bit, trying to get my students to also understand and acknowledge the meaning or the significance of human rights. And let me just go for it and just be patient with these arbitrary thoughts that I have. It would be the case if one were to talk about the connect between sustainable development goals, human rights, and issues of poverty and inequality, then we should typically be talking about measures to achieve these ends. Or perchance some would speak cynically of the connections, and yet others would speak rhetorically about the necessity of making the connection. All of these are very important for the discourse on sustainable development goals, but my concerns are a little different, and they are basically is that the point that we need to have a serious conceptual interaction, and one that is necessarily interdisciplinary across these terms to strengthen, ratify the grid over which this conversation can take place. If human rights are indeed to be mobilized, which they must, to push the SDG agenda, in particular to mitigate poverty and inequality, then conceptual questions need to be forefronted. In relation to this, I'd like to raise 3 points over the course of my presentation, and I hope to, out of this, make some kind of a broadish sort of an analytical point, which may or may not have any significance. The first point I want to raise is the following. It's of course impossible to present anything that approaches a genealogy of sustainable development goals here, but it's widely enough acknowledged that the Millennium Development Goals were the precursors of the Sustainable Development Goals. Some of the necessity for the Sustainable Development Goals is attributed to the paucity of the Millennial Development Goals. It is often said that the targets and aspirations of the Millennium Development Goals were not met because, among other things, these goals were too thinly expressed to make a difference. A series of stated goals and no clear indication on how to put the aspiration into action. The broad problem that we are obliged to confront is that, for one, in spite of a huge increase in wealth, there continues to be inordinate levels of absolute and relative poverty. That is, we have growth with persistent want. The rhetoric of human rights in itself can exhort us in the direction of standard redistribution. You can think of a lot of the kinds of things that Jaiti was talking about in the morning. Taxation, there are these things about national health, education policies, etc. And if this were so, it would remain a domestic issue subject to the internal sovereign politics of a nation. However, the trajectory of contemporary growth has not only generated inequities but also environmental devastation, and if things continue in the same path, there appears to be a high probability that the generation of future wealth will be compromised, or better still, end with a catastrophe. Thus, the rhetorical success, and I use the word rhetorical here not as a pejorative term, the rhetorical success of the SDGs is perhaps in the large sets of goals covering both concerns, namely want and the environment simultaneously, inherently realizing that these matters are not trade-offs, but rather on account of their complexity, they are interconnected. To state it using a slightly different discourse, the SDGs are imagined in terms of a situation which transcends territory. But if there is no territory, then there is no sovereignty, literally by definition. Where earlier human rights were specifically and explicitly listed, now they form the grid or the frame in the Sustainable Development Goals. Alongside environmental concerns, they are the norms that travel across borders. By themselves, human rights may be politically still unacceptable, which they aren't. They are not acceptable, they're often too Western, they're too not Eastern, and so on and so forth. But as a part of a package for the future of humanity, maybe they become somewhat acceptable. However, both human rights as well as environmental concerns, since they both work without borders and territory, are in direct conflict with sovereignty, particularly contemporary notion of sovereignty, which has discovered both tradition and unapologetic greed simultaneously. To me, this sense of sovereignty is in a constant battle with Sustainable Development Goals. I can come up with many examples. I just want to point out that in the Times of India of October 19th, we find a columnist saying that the Justice Chandrachud's invocation of dignity of the individual is against Indian ethos. It is a piece there in the Times of India, October 19th, you may kindly go and see it. It's this force that stalls many progressive developments rather than capitalism in itself. In this, the SDG 16 that calls for peace, justice, and strong institutions is probably one of the most important requirements for the SDGs to fructify. It's because it is through a counter to popular sovereignty, which is a big force now, which does end up countering the SDG goals in at least some ways. This is a tension which is very much there, and how can you have gender equality if you do not respect or do not accept the term that dignity is for all, for men and women? And that's my first point. The second point is to realize that if human rights are to emancipate, then there needs to be a material base to this. The SDGs engage with this at multiple levels, and I want to highlight this important set of connections. I don't know if these connections are correct, but we need to perhaps reorient our thinking a bit more in the direction for the full potential of the move to manifest itself. The first point to note is that SDGs are framed to ensure that livelihoods need to be sustainable for the system to function. But it's also a step further. We need to think, we are so accustomed to thinking of rights, especially human rights, in relation to the state, that we forget that much of the human right aspiration is also in relation to fellow human beings. This means that increasingly we have to think creatively about a horizontal reading of rights rather than the more obvious vertical reading. It's only through a horizontal reading of rights that things can move on. In this context, it's easy to make the state a target, but we forget that the state is often enough a mere partial manifestation of wider social forces, and by constantly positioning ourselves only in relation to the state, we lose our ability to see that we need our rights in relation to each other. The dignity, autonomy, and well-being of individual human against the hegemony and oppression of fellow humans. In this, the SDGs have a very importantly plugged into the discourse that involves the world of corporations, not only on moral grounds, but also emphasizing that a lot of the material basis of SDGs involves the presence and participation of business. While now, on a larger scale, this has started off as the CSR movement, it's of course orthodoxy to seek the corporation as the source of abuse of human rights. And much of this discourse is not incorrect. Nevertheless, so much so as corporations and businesses are acknowledged parts of society globally and locally, I would push for a complementary understanding. In recent work under review for publication, where I, along with Yasmin Arif, have argued that to appreciate and understand CSR, we need to understand the economy from a heterodox perspective. One way is to invoke the heterodox political economy suggested by the French theorist Bataille, who asks us to think of an economy not in the customary terms of scarcity, but rather in the terms of excess. For Bataille, an economy like a biological system produces an excess of energy. This excess can be translated into destructive activity as in war, or to put to some unproductive use by excessive consumption. But the interesting insight is the suggestion that some or all of this excess can be given away, and the act of giving may not entail straightforward reciprocity. The manner of dealing with this excess is perhaps to generate a gift economy, and the CSR endeavor can surely be placed in this formulation. This, of course, raises the very important point of how law engages with the gift economy. We have a well-established understanding between the exchange economy and law, but not so much the case in relation to the gift economy. I would hazard that connections can be gleaned if we realize that it is the constitutive element of law that is at the forefront here. The Indian law on CSR is an interesting case in point. Apart from decreeing a 2% corporate profits must be spent on CSR, the law does not define what is CSR, but instead through the rules pushes corporations to choose from a list which began with a listing of the Millennium Development Goals, but now also includes concerns of national interest. It is, if you like, the law channeling excess funds into what a social world imagines is of importance for advancing society without putting pressure on the resources of the state. This was a brief glance at the Indian case, but there is a wider world out there, and there is now speak of the global corporate citizenship. In Germany, for example, in all this, very differently from the Indian case, and particularly law that encapsulates the values of human rights, has come to constitute a frame from which acts of giving can be governed and oriented. My third point, if we insist on viewing the economy in conventional terms, and therefore the regulation of the economy as well as in conventional terms, then we are forced to largely think in terms of regulating production. Production activities must be sustainable, so sustainable standards need to target activities of producers. This evokes a moral response. Surely those who consume unsustainably need to temper their demand just as much as producers seeking to eke out their livelihoods need to produce sustainably. The connection between the use of resources and livelihood has been emphasized as a critical component of the sustainable development idea, but framed as such, it only features the consumer as the income earner, but not as the final consumer of output. I'm going somewhere with this thing. Now, if we leave the issue here, it's nothing more than the articulation of a moral reprimand. It is to ask the sovereign consumer to put some brakes. But why would such a consumer...
Brakes.
Yeah. Why would such a sovereign consumer put on the brakes? What system can be designed that will compel a consumer to consume sustainably? In my opinion, if we insist on treating the consumer as sovereign, and read rational. So sovereignty for me in this little talk comes twice. One, the sovereign as in Trump, and sovereign as the consumer. Rational, we are not going to make much analytical headway. We need to realize that sustainability, sustainable development requires us to be global citizen, and translated into our immediate concern, the consumer not as sovereign consumer, but as the citizen consumer, a citizen with rights, of course, but also duties. The analytical reboot requires us to think differently. We have to move away from the mainstream economics of the consumer and think of alternate formulations. Thinking a bit about the need for a reboot, well, heterodox economics has been around for a while, but the environmental state of the world perhaps makes us resurrect many of these ostensibly maverick thoughts now. Gandhi and others, writing in the traditions such as Kumarappa and Schumacher, speak of countering the economy of avarice with the economy of permanence, an attitude to life which seeks fulfillment in the single-minded pursuit of wealth and does not fit into this world because it contains within itself no limiting principle, while the environment in which it is placed is strictly limited. To quote Gandhi, quoted by Schumacher, the earth provides enough to satisfy every man's need, but not every man's greed. An economy of permanence, read sustainable, is unachievable without some regulation of consumption. If we accept this as a conceptual base, then while a moral exhortation to contract consumption is well and good, we come back to the question, how is this embodied in law and regulation? My contention is that while I do not make a specific proposition at this stage, it is possible that substantive law can seek to contain excessive and irresponsible consumption. A simple example is the law that requires households to segregate categories of garbage for better waste disposal. This is the more alarming issue of plastics. While production technologies may help, the only way is to eliminate controlled plastic use. Beyond a point, this demands controlling consumption, while production technologies may improve the situation only with a very small probability. To bring the implicit point I wish to make to the fore, I want to return to the critique of rights stated by I don't know what to call her, theorist, anyway, she was a crazy person, Simone Weil, who in 1952 in the cult book The Need for Roots, where she states that rights are personal and consist of rights to personal things, thereby associating rights with force, exchange and exclusion. Obligations for her are more primitive than rights. Famously, she tells us a man left alone in the universe would have no rights whatever, but he would have obligations. Or another quote, or an obligation comes before that of rights, which is subordinate and relative to the former. If indeed obligations are central to the human endeavor, and that is what positive rights are, then law can maybe best effect positive rights by shaming he who does not give. In this context, it is interesting that for all the hard law discourse in the Indian CSR situation, the final binding requirement is shame or shaming. Effectively, the burden, as mentioned earlier, is to explain why 2% of the profits have not been spent on CSR in the annual report. It seems that this kind of CSR practice echoes Weil when she says, an obligation which goes unrecognized by anybody loses none of the full force of its existence. A right which goes unrecognized by anybody is not worth very much. This is thought-provoking in relation to the little example that I put out of Indian CSR, and I am by no means saying that Indian CSR is wonderful. In fact, I've had students who have shown that it is used by Indian companies to actually evade tax. But it's the idea that I'm making a gesture towards. As well as the limited consumption economy we seek, where livelihoods, consumption and giving work together. It's important for us to explore law in these contexts, and I wish to conclude finally by really echoing what Jayati Ghosh tried to bring to the fore amongst many things in the morning, that one of the legacies of the person whom we are celebrating today was that he was imagining or thinking or thought it was possible, being an economist, that it was possible to bring together law, economy, and society in some sort of a way. This also demands us, in our imagination, to look upon law as we seek these means to sort of counter poverty, inequality, and all the other things in some kind of a way, where law is understood a little bit more and given due and celebrated, as well as fortified as expressive law and not merely as imperative law. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for a very, very rich exposition. And this proves the point we were making in the beginning. We have a very wide-ranging topic. And since you mentioned the speech this morning, and you mentioned the Supreme Court here, I was a bit surprised that the role of the Supreme Court of India had not been mentioned in her presentation. She said, like, the rights that we're developing have to be find the basis in law, but we have found that the Supreme Court goes beyond what's in the law, and in fact dictates that law has to be enacted when it's not, including in the field that you discussed this morning and which you just discussed. Well, I thank you again, and I'm sure that other people will follow up on the points you have made. So, right, you carry on? Thank you.
Intellectual debt to Dr. Sengupta. In fact, it was at his insistence that I got into the field of human rights, and a wonderful field where I learned so much over the years, and he was very much instrumental in setting some of my research agenda in the years that followed. So I'm really very happy to be here and part of this deliberation today in celebration of Dr. Sengupta's contribution to not only the policy-making domain where he spent most of his life, but in bridging, as JV said. JV incidentally is my classmate, and there's another common factor here that Dr. Sengupta spent some of his time at the center where where JV is presently located in JNU. So a lot of coincidences here. Right. Let me just come to the topic of the panel this afternoon. It is about whether rights can play a role in implementing human rights, in implementing SDGs, and with a particular focus on poverty and inequality. So the first point I want to make is that it is not a question about can. I would like to argue it should be and must be, and I will try to elaborate on those terms that I am emphatically using in my starting opening statement. And I think this has to be done at two levels. The first level is in setting the agenda. And fortunately this time around, unlike in the case of MDGs, I think we were lucky. The UN process learned from its acts of omission and omission from the earlier round, and actually launched a very extensive consultative process, of which I was also a participant in 2 or 3 places globally, in South Africa, in Germany and elsewhere. And so there were amendments in the process that the UN was steering. And the result was that we have a set of goals which are more reflective of the kind of concerns and reality that we are engaging with than was the case with the MDGs. So that part has been done. So this is the first level that has been done. But even this task is far from over. What we have done is we have set up a sustainable development agenda at the global level. But we haven't yet translated it to the national and the subnational level. And that's where I think the rights discourse, the rights tools to which Steve alluded a little while ago, the whole work on human rights indicators, of which I have also been a contributor, it is very, very important in trying to take this international agenda to the sub-national and national and sub-national level. So that's one task that still needs to be done, and I'll come back to this a bit later in my presentation. The second is rights can play a very critical role in guiding the process for implementing the rights, irrespective of what the goal. It can play a guiding role to the process of implementing the SDGs, irrespective of what the SDGs that one is dealing with. So that process has to be influenced in a manner, and the rights discourse can be a way forward there to get to the objectives that the global community has put before itself. Now, the question is, how do we mobilize this for addressing inequality and poverty? In fact, let me say, and maybe I might be a little provocative here, I don't think poverty is a problem. We will get over with absolute poverty. We have made a great progress in the last 15 years during the tenure of the first MDGs. China has done wonderfully well there. India is also making progress. But the major challenge, a major global challenge, is that of inequality, both in the advanced countries as well as in the developing countries. And I think that's the area where rights have a potential contribution. But before I put down a few pointers on how the rights framework can contribute there, let me just reflect a little bit about the nature of inequality that we are facing. The nature of inequality is more about in the space of opportunities than the space of outcomes. In the advanced countries, however, it's the other way around. The point I'm trying to make is that one has to look at the inequalities discourse in terms of in a kind of more dynamic sense, where the inequalities and opportunities have a critical role, and that has to be addressed. But when we look at what is happening around the world, and there is ample evidence to suggest that inequalities in outcomes, and when I talk of outcomes, I'm talking of income, wealth, and so on and so forth, they are rising, and they are at highest point in several decades in the advanced countries. Whereas there are inequalities in opportunities, and when I talk of opportunities, I'm talking of access to basic services, social services, financial services, and we capture these accesses through looking at and tracking what is happening on health attainments, on education attainments, on financial inclusion, etc., and so on and so forth. So, as far as the developed world is concerned, the advanced world is concerned, the inequalities and opportunities are not so significant. And it's exactly the other way around in the developing world, where inequalities and opportunities are becoming worse, which has a intergenerational consequence. I mean, people who are able to access the best education would also land up with the best livelihood opportunities. And so they would end up perpetuating a process which is already iniquitous and which will consolidate over time, leading to even worse outcomes. But in respect of outcome inequality, it is less severe than in the developing world than in the developed world. Now, when you keep this evidence in mind, the question that one asks is, how can rights help us address these concerns? And more specifically, how does human right law helps us in catering to these? So, human rights is about entitlements, more so about legal entitlements. And this morning in the plenary session, or rather the inaugural session, there was a question raised from the floor. The question was that, have we got the rights discourse right, or is there a need for a rethink on that? And I actually want to, there was a question from a lady on this side of the table. Oh, it was you, sorry, I'm so sorry. So her question was, and maybe you could articulate your question better than what yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just saying what Professor Jayati Ghosh had said about the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural
Employment Guarantee
Act. And when she was also saying, she was also looking at the mixed results from there. And she also said that it was a mix of political and statutory and policy and social intervention. And I think she presented it as an interesting case study. I have been also thinking about it because I have to speak for the next session also, and I've been thinking hard about what rights mean and why is it that so there was also a conversation on populist, governments adopting populist measures. And so I asked her, how come we are, we have a surge of populist governments? And why is it that we are seemingly giving up on rights? Is it something does it tell us something about what we didn't do right
with the rights discourse?
Pursuit of rights. Yeah. Are we missing something? And I suggested that probably these laws that didn't work well, the laws that looked good otherwise, the UPA government's
Feel good, look good.
Yes,
feel good,
yes,
look good
yes.
laws. We didn't really politicize the rights there. It was a very top-down, it was tending to be a top-down kind of intervention, and probably that is one of the reasons that these kind of laws and rights don't deliver.
So my take is, yes, I think there is a need also to have a rethink on the way we want to take the rights discourse forward. And my take is very limited. I mean, my take is that rights discourse need not be overtly fixated with creating legal entitlements. I think there's much more depth, there's much more that the rights discourse has to offer in influencing policies. And those policies need not again be based on creating legal entitlements. And that's where some of the conflict between the neoliberal and the left of center thinking to approach policies can be brought to some sort of a convergence. So the point is that legal entitlement is just one of the ways to move forward when we're looking at the issues of inequalities and opportunities, especially in the developing world. There are and laws do help. I mean, laws do create a framework for overcoming multiple exclusions, multiple discriminations, which are truly characteristics of segments of population who are the worst sufferers of that inequality. Yet, I think the rights discourse, both in terms of the standards that it brings into the policy discourse, as well as the instrumentalities it brings in by way of creating more accountable frameworks, has a lot more to offer to the policy making. And I think there is a path available that has come out of the work undertaken at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights that Steve alluded to, which tries to show how these instrumentalities can be integrated to bridge the two discourses, the rights discourse on one hand and the policy discourse on the other hand, in specifically focusing on these inequalities. And Javid made a reference to the goal 16. In fact, not far back, a few months ago, maybe almost a year ago, I was working with the government of Tunisia, the site of the Arab Spring, the first country where Arab Spring took off. And they had engaged me through the UNDP to figure out how they could actually operationalize Goal 16. And what we were doing there was basically bringing in the work that Steve contributed to as a part of the chair of the high-level panel on right to development at the Office of the High Commissioner, and the kind of work that I also supported at that office, which is about creating quantitative indicators on rights, which could then peg policies more explicitly anchored in the rights framework to address these concerns. So what I wanted to mention in conclusion was, I think we have to look beyond just creating legal entitlement, because ultimately legal entitlements do require resources, and resources do have an impact on the bottom line in any country. And if the bottom line starts coming apart, then it is so much more difficult to take everybody along on what not only requires a bit of a time to get to the objectives that we set for ourselves, but also in terms of public support around those issues. So let me conclude simply by saying that rights discourse has a lot to offer in tackling inequalities and opportunities, and that's what should be the focus of our policies. That's what should be the focus if we are to make success of the SDGs over the next decade and a half for which they have been articulated. I'll stop here, but maybe I'll come back in the course of discussions that follow. Thank you.
Thank you again. It's a very rich discourse. One is overwhelmed by the possibilities and the availability of an analysis like this. And I like the thought that we were comparing the original goals to the millennium to the sustainable. I was present when they first were adopted, and I thought it was a very feel-good, look-good process. And they did learn from that. We have a much better starting point. Thank you. So, please.
Development goals or human rights in terms of discourse or practice. What I'm going to do here is to see them as universal frameworks and the lives and the many lives that they take at a more local level. So my research is primarily on the developmental state in India. So I want to speak a bit about how these sustainable development goals and human rights might bring in something to make development much more well-rounded in the Indian context and address issues like poverty and inequality. So India is signatory to the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, as we all know. The National Institution for Transforming India, or the Niti Aayog, the body that replaced the Planning Commission of India, oversees the implementation of the SDGs. In 2017, it organized something called a National Development Consultation on the SDGs, in which each of these different goals were discussed and debated upon, reports were filed, and the consultations involved central ministries, state governments, experts, academics, international organizations, and various other stakeholders. Now what has happened from the Niti Aayog downwards is that state governments have tried to include SDGs in the development programs that they design. A lot of times this is about the language of policy that is used, about how the policy guidelines are framed, so they kind of try to allude to them in many different ways, and in turn, then they have to mobilize the development machinery at the district and block levels. As all of you might be familiar, in terms of rural development, there's a kind of hierarchy of organizations and bureaucracy that one goes through. And so you have the state governments, then you have district, then you have block, which is sort of seen as the smallest level, and then there are villages as part of the blocks. So basically the idea is that through these different levels, these agendas that the Sustainable Development Goals promote would percolate through development and welfare schemes, which the central and state governments anyway implement, and Sustainable Development Goals would become a part of those. So the state in which I did much of my research is West Bengal, and in several of its development programs, the language that was employed used the vocabulary of Sustainable Development Goals. For example, a very popular scheme known as the Kanya Shri scheme, which looks at the promotion of education of girls, is connected to the Sustainable Development Goal 4, education. Similarly, another program called Rupashri, which is aimed at the elimination of child marriage, is linked to Sustainable Development Goal number 5, that's gender equality. So I'm just giving these examples to show how universal self-sustainable development goals are translated into locally specific policy measures, even though we might see that, this translation might just be limited so far to the policy discourse or the policy guidelines itself. Basically after 2015, some of the existing programs also, they rejigged the language to bring in SDGs as part of the vocabulary of what was welfare and development there. And the Niti Aayog then maps the performance of each state in terms of how they are responding to the SDG Vision 2030. And there are several sectors under which these goals are clubbed. For example, rural development is one such sector. So under rural development, the goals that are listed are SDG 1, no poverty, SDG 3, good health, SDG 4, quality education, 5, gender equality, 6, clean water and sanitation, 8, good jobs and economic growth, and SDG 10, reduced inequality. So all of them come under rural development. They might also come into similar different headings like this. So now one of the focus of rural development in India and this clubbing of SDGs under this heading of rural development, one of them is self-help and self-employment. And much of my research focused on self-help groups. So now self-help groups are groups which comprise of 8 to 10 members who pool in their savings together. And this was started as part of the Indian government's anti-poverty program, and now is also increasingly becoming a tool to promote self-employment, the self-help groups. I focused on this one loan program called Mukti Dhara, which started in certain districts of southwest Bengal. Now these were districts which had been the center of the Maoist movement in West Bengal, and a lot of development programs were launched in addition to security measures to ensure that local populations are weaned away from the Maoists. Of course, there was a level of violence that is involved even when development is implemented in such a context, and that was definitely there, but there were different kinds of responses to these development programs. So now this loan program, I'll just tell you very briefly about it since I don't have that much time, was launched in 2013, and this was focusing specifically on women's self-help groups. And the idea was that they would get subsidized loans up to 100,000 rupees. So the interest rate is what would be subsidized, and this would create and support self-employment for women who are below the poverty line. And they identified several different livelihood options that these women could pursue, from vegetable cultivation to rice cultivation with high yielding varieties of paddy, and using improved techniques, rearing of goats, poultry, and setting up centers to stitch utensils made out of leaves, whether it's plates or bowls and so on. So it was launched in 2013, and in 2015 they sort of revised the guidelines of this Mukti Dhara program, which Mukti Dhara roughly translates as source of freedom. So they brought in self-development, sustainable development goals 1 and 5 as part of the policy guidelines here too. So now I just gave this example to talk about how this universal vocabulary is sort of being put in policy guidelines here. And in addition to just the policy guidelines, there's a developing bureaucracy across scales that makes sure that these sustainable development goals enter policy making and are not limited to just in India being a signatory there. So at the central, state, district and block level, there are different ways in which they are talked about among bureaucrats and policy makers. So what I would like to draw attention to here is how universals like the SDGs translate into local contexts. So in a sense, what is happening is that these universal goals are becoming localized when talking about framing and implementing policy. So the universal and local then do not remain completely separate from each other in this case. Universal ideals are appropriated in different contexts and then take a life of its own. So what I'm proposing is that we need to study the space, the cultural, social and political space between the universal and the local here, and this can be a productive way of looking at international development itself. Here I use anthropologist Anna Singh's idea of engaged universals. So there are universal ideas, but they become engaged in very specific local contexts, and that is what I argue SDGs might have the potential to become in the Indian context. So that's on the one hand self-sustainable development goals. Now on the other hand, the subjects of development, those who these development programs target, rely on a different kind of universal, which is dignity and self-worth, which is intrinsically linked to the language of rights. Now this is where human rights come in. Now take the example of Asha, who was one of my interlocutors when I was doing my fieldwork in rural West Bengal. She was not too happy with this Muktidhara program that I just told you a bit about. When I asked her why, she said that this microfinance or loan is not what she wants. She wanted the local state office to give her employment instead of providing a loan. She said this would help her build a role for herself outside the household. She would be out in the public sphere, while at the same time will also give her a livelihood option. And I asked her why does she think that this is something that should be made available to her. So she asserted that she said this is the word she used is adhikar or right. So she was here, I probed her more, and she was not essentially referring to the Constitution of India that as a citizen this is the right she deserves, but she says that this was more about well-being, and it was her trying in small ways to challenge existing gender norms. Of course, I mean, it's a very limited way of challenging it, but so the idea here was that there is a universal idea of rights, that everyone has this kind of a right. Of course, she was making this claim on the state, and she knew that well, but her idea of rights was something which was beyond what the state and constitution had enshrined somewhere. So eventually a middle ground was actually found where the bloc administration was slightly more responsive here than they might have been in other situations, because this was what they have defined as a left-wing extremist district. So the middle ground was that there were certain sewing machines that the block office bought and set up a business center. So they did not employ people, but they provided them with this infrastructure where women could go and stitch whatever they wanted and then sell it. So through these two different aspects that I've talked about, one, the bureaucracy and the SDGs, and two, rights and the subjects of development, the key idea that I'm talking about here is that of translation. So translation of SDGs in policies of development states on the one hand, and translation of rights for development subjects on the other. So if we bring together translation at these two translations of these two different things together, perhaps a more effective strategy to deal with poverty and inequality can be devised. So universals then need not remain universal. So universal frameworks of SDGs and human rights, once translated into the local and then the different forms they take into the local, might be the way in which we can think of more effective policy measures which are linked to these universal frameworks. Thank you.
But comment, something that always goes through my mind when listening to discussion of this nature, started this morning, the distinction between the state and the citizen. And in many countries, they're the same. The state represents the citizens. The citizens determine who the state is. Many countries not. That doesn't matter. In our discussion, we always distinguish between the state and the citizen, or citizenry. And I think what you were talking about at the very beginning of the discussion, the sovereignty of the people, vis-a-vis the sovereignty of the government. I wish we could get better feel of that, and that's something that always. In a UN context, we have to understand that that's a body of states, and to the extent that they're representing the world community is a question. We look at those people; they are voting one state, one vote. So please, now we will pass on to you. You may have heard that we were at this lecture this morning.